Great. I'm Colleen Mahar-Piersma, she said, at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and I'm a satisfied client of...
I'm Ben Johnson. I'm a co-founder and game developer at Dozen Eyes, which is a small game studio in Brooklyn.
So our task, my task at the Center for Applied Linguistics is working on orientation for refugees who come to the US. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about refugees because I think it might be a non-standard audience. Refugees are people who are outside their country. They cannot return because they have been persecuted or they have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So I want everyone to close their eyes just for a moment. Keep in mind I can see you if you keep them open. Okay, and just think, there but for the grace of God, go I, right? Refugees could be anyone. Okay, open your eyes again. Thanks, everyone. All right, so some examples very quickly are refugees who are Congolese in exile in Rwanda, refugees from Burma who are in Malaysia, Syrians in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Egypt, the list goes on and on, right? So each year, tens of thousands of refugees resettle in the US for a new life. Basically, when you read the newspaper and you hear about a bombing, a flood, an attack, or a flood, but not simply a natural disaster, but something building on top of some other disaster, often those people, very, very few of them, may eventually make their way to the US. So the US has resettled more than 3.2 million refugees since 1975, which is a big number, but it's much bigger when you think about how many of those people had children and grandchildren and so on. So we have a huge number of people who came to the US as refugees. They're very diverse, and this was really relevant when we talked about the game that we'll discuss in a moment, because there are some people who are, in fact, putting their fingerprint on their documents as they come into the US. They're putting their fingerprint on their lease, they're putting their fingerprint on, WIC, and so on. There are, however, other refugees who are very highly skilled, highly educated, very familiar with Western life, as you would imagine. So this picture is of an app created by a Syrian refugee in Turkey who created it for other Syrian refugees there to navigate their way through the systems and services available. So when we're looking at assisting refugees, we have to think about the fact that we've got people from throughout the gamut, basically. So customarily, refugees receive orientation about life in the US, both before they come and after. And it's in classes, and they're very interactive. They're not boring, generally. They really get people an opportunity to grasp with the material and consider it. And then there's also print and video material. But we really felt strongly that we wanted refugees to have a chance to have orientation basically outside that box. And someone who had come as a refugee from Serbia actually was the first person to suggest it. He said, why not a game? So we thought, why not a game, right? So we looked for something that would allow refugees to learn independently, to reflect on their own goals, and to consider how to address realistic challenges that they would encounter throughout resettlement. And I will say two more things before turning it over to Ben to talk about the game that was made. One is that this funding was provided by the Department of State, Bureau of Populations, Refugees and Migration, which meant that every message had to be vetted and vetted again and vetted again. Is this really what we want to convey? So there was lots of work on that. And then the second part is that many of the people who are serving refugees are gatekeepers. So someone mentioned before, bring the games to the people, not the peoples to the games. You have a refugee service provider, they've got too many clients, not enough time, people who aren't speaking English. They don't necessarily want something new. And so that was a huge challenge that we turned over to Ben and his partner Phoenix, was we need something that's gonna allow people to engage with the material, but is very, very accessible. Okay?
So when we started working on this project, I'm just gonna switch over here to, so this was sort of what the project ended up looking like. We ended up doing the entire game in about 9 months with a content update 1 month afterwards to kind of fit in feedback that we got from refugee centers and so on. And the development team was 2 people and a contractor. So this was a really tight project. We started out doing pre-production research. We read through the 700-page educational program that the refugees get, and figured out how we would take aspects of that and adapt them into a video game. We also ended up doing paper prototyping. It turned out that in the early sort of discussion phases, we were talking about different directions we could take the game. We could do something that was, that told a very specific story, but hit on, specific points, but might not be immediately relatable to anyone who picked it up. Or we could do something that was broader. We ultimately decided to go with something that used a lot of design language from board games. And because the game worked so strongly as a board game, and it turned out that we actually really liked the idea of possibly being able to then take the video game and adapt it into a board game in case we needed to run it someplace where there was like not a lot of electricity. It wound up being something that we could spend a lot of time in the paper prototype phase because all the mechanics, the entire game became playable before we wrote a single line of code. Which was a really great thing that we got to explore on this project. And then we dove into the actual coding portion of the project and got the game out on New Year's Eve, which is pretty exciting. So the big challenge of working on a game like this is, and I think a lot of social impact games have run up against this issue, which is that games are by nature abstract. They're a simplified version of a system that you can contain inside your brain and understand and play with and work on and get good at. And human lives are really complicated. And I think that the sorts of problems that we want to address in social impact games, they are human problems. And inevitably, when you try to simplify a system to the point where it works mechanically as a game, you inevitably find yourself saying like, well, is it important that we address this issue, or can we kind of file that off because it makes it work better as a play experience? What we ended up doing ultimately, like I was saying earlier, was we pushed into, we started looking at strategy games. The mechanics that we chose are, if you're familiar with worker placement board games like Agricola or Lords of Waterdeep or I guess Shadows over Camelot, which is the lower in the lower left or lower, yeah, your lower left corner. These are games where the player has a certain number of actions. They're requiring resources, and then kind of figuring out how to spend those resources over time. What this turns into, we talked a lot about the idea that the game mechanics themselves contain a message, and so you want to make sure that you understand what that message is. In this case, when you're asking the player to collect resources and spend them, what you're asking them to do really is balance long-term and short-term goals and decision-making. The player is asked not just what is it that I want, but what is it that makes sense to do right now. Maybe the thing I want most is something that I should hold off on, or maybe something that was a really good idea last time I played is actually not a great idea this time just because of like how the game was structured. How opportunities presented themselves over time. In addition to this sort of broad message that kind of hits on a lot of things that come out of these sort of how to get by in the United States materials that come out of the education program. We also had, there were of course lots of very specific things that deal with like how to deal with like taxes or legal issues in the United States, or like how to handle various problems. We knew that we were going to get people asking us, well, why isn't this issue in the game? And so one of the things we did to address that was that we, in between each of these sort of the main turns of the game, we created these scenarios so that anytime we had somebody who felt like this is a specific issue that's really important and we need to make sure we address it, that we had ways to do that. These situations are ones where there's not necessarily always one right answer. Sometimes, like in this case, those top two questions there require the player to have a certain level of English proficiency before they can be selected. So there are situations, these are chosen randomly so the player doesn't necessarily know. You might get into trouble early on in the game and find yourself with a situation that's impossible to resolve in a great way, and that the only options for you are bad. But you understand over multiple plays of the game that that is just, sometimes this happens and you need to figure out like how would you prepare in case that occasion was to come about. One of the things that I really liked about working on this game was we really got a chance to think about the context in which the game is played. this game was not meant to sort of exist completely outside of the educational program that it's based on. It's intended to be sort of a supplement to that. And I think that what is important to me about that is that the educational system that is run involves a lot of gameplay and a lot of role play and a lot of direct human interaction. And I think that it's something that's really worth thinking about if you're working on a video game, that you think about the things that humans do really well, like that sort of interpersonal communication and creating, simulating human interaction experiences, which video games don't do so well. And we were able to make use of that. So this is a quote from Kentaro Toyama, who he did an interview recently in the MIT Technology Review, and his experience of working in India for the last 5 years, working with different cultures, is that it is often just as much about the human beings that you partner with when you're working on a technology project as it is about any particular tech solution you create. And that I felt was definitely true in this one. So that's our talk. Get in touch if you feel like making something. Thank you.